Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War, the Prussians called it the Third Silesian War, Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years. So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class, me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one thing as making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception, which means it's time for a montage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisbourg. The biggest victory of all came in September when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida Florida from Spain. In return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about the author of the mystery document, I will be shocked by electricity. If I am right, I will be shocked by my knowledge of 18th century primary sources. Okay, here we go. We humbly conceive that it is contrary to the maxims of good policy and extremely dangerous to our frontiers to suffer any Indians of what tribe soever to live within the inhabited parts of this province while we are engaged in an Indian war, as experience has taught us that they are all perfidious, and their claim to freedom and independence puts it in their power to act as spies, to entertain and give intelligence to our enemies, and to furnish them with provisions and warlike stores. To this fatal intercourse between our pretended friends and open enemies, we must ascribe the greatest of the ravages and murders that have been committed in the course of this and the last Indian War. We therefore pray that this grievance be taken under consideration and remedied. Enough. Usually you either know it or you don't. And I don't. The author is clearly not an Indian. The first person plural makes me think the author is probably not an individual, which makes it harder. Certainly we're getting a taste of the tension between colonists and Native Americans on the frontier. But who is writing about this tension, I have absolutely no idea. Stan, you get to shock me. Who is it? Are you serious? I told you it has to be an individual person! Fine. Ah! So after the end of the 7 Years' War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. So the settlers duly ignored the proclamation line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism initially meant supporting a government without a king, but in the colonies it came to mean something broader. Now, they didn't believe that everyone was equal. Republicans believed that only property-owning citizens possessed virtue, which was defined in the 18th century not as being like morally good, but as a willingness to subordinate one's personal interest to the public good. This type of republicanism harkened back to a Roman ideal, only, you know, without Caesar stabbing and togas. Stan, I wish you wouldn't. And a second type of political philosophy grew out of ideas that in the 18th century were called liberalism. For classical liberals, the main task of government was to protect citizens' natural rights, which were defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. For liberals like Locke, governments were the result of a social contract whereby individuals would give up some of their liberty in exchange for a government protecting their natural rights. So republicanism and liberalism were undermining traditional political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, oh my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith in governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video, you can ask them in comments, where they will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we begin discussing the American Revolution. So 2 things to keep in mind here. 1, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence are not the same thing. And 2, while I know this will upset some of you, the American Revolution was not really about taxes. Mr. Green, it was about tea, right? Also, it was not about tea. The Boston Tea Party was about taxes and our God-given right to smuggle. It's a little confusing me from the past, but that's why Crash Course is here. So as you'll recall, the 7 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which made the colonists cranky because it limited their ability to take land from the Indians, and it also left them holding the bag for a lot of war debt. Wars, as you may have noticed, are expensive, and the British government had to borrow £150 million, and the interest payments on that money ate up half of the national budget. So in order to pay for the war, the British decided to raise taxes. And since the primary beneficiaries of the war had been the American colonists, the British government felt it was only fair if some of the burden fell to them. Now, taxes on colonial trade were nothing new. The British government had placed taxes on a bunch of items in order to reduce competition with Britain, including wool and hats and molasses. Why did they place a tax on molasses? It doesn't seem like that would be a huge market. Oh, molasses. Right, of course. But those taxes were about trying to regulate trade in a mercantilist way more than trying to pay back war debt, and also they were easy to avoid via smuggling, which we did because this is America. But mostly the colonists were angry because they didn't have any say about the new taxes that Britain was imposing. I mean, after all, by 1760, some colonies had been setting their own taxes through their own legislatures for 100 years. So the taxes themselves weren't really the problem. It was their lack of parliamentary representation. The first purportedly oppressive tax, the Sugar Act of 1764, extended the Molasses Act by changing the tax on imports from the Caribbean from 6 cents per gallon all the way up to 3 cents per gallon. So they actually cut the tax, but they decided to start enforcing it by stamping out smuggling. And to that end, the act also gave British courts the right to try colonial smugglers, taking that power away from colonial courts, which had been notoriously lenient when it came to smuggling on account of how they enjoyed smuggled rum as much as the next guy. But those initial acts weren't nearly as annoying as the Stamp Act, passed in 1765. The Stamp Act declared that all printed material had to carry a stamp. Unsurprisingly, that stamp was not free. This was purely to gain revenue for Britain, and it mostly affected people who used a lot of paper, you know, like newspaper printers and lawyers, just the kind of people you want to anger about taxes. So in October, protesters organized the Stamp Act Congress, which after a meeting decided to boycott British goods. And this was the first major coordinated action by all the colonies together, and it might be the first time that we can speak of the colonies acting in a united way, almost like, say, a government. Committees of correspondence, which had been created to encourage opposition to earlier acts, now grew to coordinate the boycott efforts, and they helped people become more aware of their liberties, and they also spurred street actions that occasionally became violent. These direct actions were organized by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and guess what? Coordinated action worked. The British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they did pass the Declaratory Act, which was all like, listen, you're not the boss of us. We can tax you. We don't want to tax you right now as it happens, but we could if we wanted to, but we won't, but we could. So the repeal of the Stamp Act was seen by many in the colonies as a huge victory, but most of the people organizing the protests were elites, you know, the kind of people who use paper. But once you start talking about the idea of representation, everybody wants in. Meanwhile, Great Britain still needed money, so Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend got Parliament to pass new taxes in 1767. The so-called Townshend Acts also created a new Board of Customs to stop smuggling, which we didn't like one bit. You don't like it when I say we? Well, tough luck. I'm an American. Bring back the Libertage, Stan! Many colonists again responded with a boycott, and women got in on the act this time, with the Daughters of Liberty encouraging homespun clothes to replace British ones. But not all the states were on board. Like, artisans loved the boycotts because they got more money. But merchants from cities like Philadelphia and New York weren't so happy because they made their livings by importing and selling the very goods that were now being boycotted. On occasion, protests did get out of hand, as in the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, which, while it was not much of a massacre, was definitely the worst outcome of a snowball fight in American history. I mean, 5 colonists were killed, including most famously Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed-race ancestry. And then, of the 9 British soldiers put on trial, 7 were acquitted and 2 were convicted only of manslaughter thanks to the top-notch lawyering of one John Adams. Don't worry, though, that guy comes around to the American cause. But overall, boycotts and protests were effective, and British merchants pushed for the repeal of these acts, leaving only a tax on tea. Let's go to the thought bubble. The 1773 Tea Act offered tax exemptions and rebates for tea coming in from the British East India Company, which allowed them to dump cheap tea on the colonies, which actually lowered the price of tea. So why were the colonists so mad that on December 16, 1773, they dressed up as Indians and dumped enough tea into Boston Harbor to cause the modern equivalent of a $4 million loss? Some colonists were upset that cheap tea would cut into the profits of smugglers and established tea merchants, but most were just angry on principle. To our great national shame, tea was at the time as important a beverage in the colonies as it was to Brits living in Britain, and to allow the British to tax a near universal product set a precedent that Britain could tax whatever they wanted. But the Tea Partiers miscalculated, thinking that the British would back down in response to their protest. Instead, the British responded by passing a series of acts that colonists came to call the Intolerable Acts. The Massachusetts Government Act curtailed self-government there. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes when ordered to. The Quebec Act extended the southern boundary of Quebec and granted religious toleration to Catholics, which was none too popular with the Great Awakening crowd having recently awoken. The colonial response to these acts is really the start of the American Revolution. First, Massachusetts passed a set of resolutions calling for colonists to 1. Disobey the Intolerable Acts, 2. Stop paying taxes, and 3. Prepare for war. And in September 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, met in Philadelphia to coordinate the resistance of the Intolerable Act. This was the First Continental Congress, which in setting up the Continental Association to police the boycott and encourage domestic manufacturing was the first real colony-wide government in British America. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So this sort of phenomenon is known by historians as kind of a big deal. I mean, coordinating action to achieve some end is what governments do, so it's not an exaggeration to say that the First Continental Congress was the first government of America. You might even say that sending delegates to Philadelphia in 1774 was the first truly revolutionary act of the American Revolution, but it was not a call for independence. However, there was a changing attitude among many colonists, because rather than seeing themselves as standing up for their rights as English people, they began to make claims based on abstract ideas about freedom and natural rights. In this respect, the Continental Congress was between worlds, because it justified its actions as liberties of free and natural-born subjects within the realm of England, but it also talked about immutable laws of nature. And this idea that all humans have certain rights derived from natural law has become a pretty big deal, not just in the United States, but also in the green lands of not America. I mean, these days, human rights is a phrase that we bandy about with Putin. Do you show up every time the words human rights are mentioned to make sure that we're talking about China and not you? And this brings me back to an important point. Although we tend to equate the two, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence were not the same thing. I mean, for one thing, the fighting started 15 months before the Declaration of Independence. For another, simply declaring independence does not make you an independent nation, as I will now demonstrate. I hereby declare this studio the independent nation of John Green, Sylvania. Yeah, see, nothing happened. The war between colonists and Britain began in 1775, on April 19th to be exact, when fighting broke out between the British soldiers and Massachusetts militiamen, the Minutemen, at Concord and Lexington, or Lexington and Concord, depending on whether you live in Lexington or Concord. This was the famous shot heard round the world, immortalized in Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So while the colonists actually lost the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, which was technically fought on Breed's Hill, the British suffered such heavy casualties that soon thereafter they were forced to abandon Boston. But then they got some revenge by taking over New York, which they held for most of the rest of the war. But in thinking about the war, it's very important to understand that not all colonists were pro-independence. Like elites in colonies like New York and Pennsylvania were very nervous about all this revolutionary fervor that was whipping up artisans and small-time farmers to think that they deserved to have say in the political process. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? Awesome, I love getting shocked. The rules here are simple. If I guess the author of the mystery document correctly, I do not get the shock pin. If I'm wrong, I do get the shock pin. All right, let's see what we got here. The Americans are properly Britons. They have the manners, habits, and ideas of Britons and have been accustomed to a similar form of government. But Britons could never bear the extremes, either of monarchy or republicanism. Some of their kings have aimed at despotism, but always failed. Repeated efforts have been made toward democracy, and they equally failed. If we may judge of future events by past transactions, in similar circumstances, this would most probably be the case in America, were a republican form of government adopted in our present ferment. All right, so we've got an educated person who thinks that Americans are Britons who will inevitably want to walk a middle path between republicanism and monarchy, and therefore that the revolution is not a good idea. I know it's a colonist because of the reference to our present ferment. All right, I'm going to guess that it is Ben Franklin's son, William Franklin? Ah, dang it! Who is it? Who the hell is Charles Inglis? Charles Inglis? Charles freaking Inglis? I've never even heard of that guy. It's not fair. Ah! Oh, I hate that. Apparently he's a bishop or something. Anyway, people like Inglis remind us that not everyone in the colonies was all fired up to be an independent nation. In fact, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, suggesting that Americans were loyal British subjects who wanted reconciliation with the mother country. But then along came Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Why couldn't that have been the mystery document? Common Sense appeared in January of 1776, and it was like the Harry Potter of its time, only with liberty instead of wizard school. Written in relatively straightforward English, the pamphlet contains many powerful rhetorical arguments, like, of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Others were just common sense, like this nugget. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Pow! Also, there's the beautiful sentiment, the weapon we have is love. Oh, that's from Harry Potter? I told you they were similar. Ultimately, Paine's arguments all contributed to the idea that America is somehow special, even exceptional. I mean, talking about independence and freedom, he said, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. That's powerful stuff, and Paine's pamphlet sold 150,000 copies, and it was extremely widely read. By the way, he still managed to die penniless, and only 8 people attended his funeral because of his vitriolic ridicule of Christianity. But anyway, America eventually declared independence for many reasons, but Paine's persuasive arguments were one important reason. And it marks a moment when the pen truly was, if not more powerful, then at least more important than the sword. I mean, within 6 months of the publication of Common Sense, the Second Continental Congress had declared independence and signed one of the most important documents in the history of the world, which is where we'll pick up next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video or anything from American history, good news, you can ask them in comments where they will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course. If you like today's video, make sure you've subscribed to our channel, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History. There are 2 kinds of revolutions. Those where things do change and those where things don't change. Like, not to get all Crash Course mathematics on you or anything, but a revolution is a 360-degree turn, which leaves you back where you started. That's what happened with the French Revolution. Basically, they just exchanged a bourbon for a Bonaparte. What? I don't have to say it all Frenchy. This is American history. And shut up, French people, about how if it weren't for your support in the American Revolution, this would be the history of southern Canada. But other revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution, actually changed things. So which was the American Revolution? Well, little of column A, little of column B. Mr. Green, yeah, we went from a bunch of rich white guys running the show all the way to a bunch of rich white guys running the show. You're not wrong, me from the past, but the 1700s were a pretty good century for rich white guys everywhere. I mean, they were running the show in Holland and Portugal and Spain, but only the United States became the country that invented baseball, the Model T, and competitive eating. So you're right, me from the past, but even if the US didn't live up to its rhetoric, that rhetoric was still powerful. And in the end, whether you care more about ideas or policy defines whether you think the American Revolution really was revolutionary. All right, let's start with the War for Independence. If you've been watching Crash Course, you'll know that we're not big on gratuitous war details, but we're obligated to tell you something about it. The main strategy of the British in the Revolutionary War was to capture all the cities and force the colonists to surrender. And the first part of that strategy pretty much worked. They captured Boston and New York and Charleston, but all the colonists had to do was not quit. I mean, they had home field advantage, knowledge of the terrain, easier supply lines, and Mr. Creepy Eyes down here. So while the British took the cities, the Americans, or Continentals, held onto the countryside. The most famous battle of the war was probably the Battle of Trenton, where Washington was like, I'm gonna cross the Delaware on Christmas morning. He had a funny voice. Everybody knows he had a funny voice. It's famous. That's a made-up fact. Don't put it on your AP tests. What do I know about Washington? Well, I know he had a funny voice. Washington surprised a bunch of Hessians, which was a pretty impressive victory, especially since he'd just come off a string of defeats. But he wasn't able to turn it into an all-out rout and ended up having to spend a miserable winter in Valley Forge. But remember, generals always get to eat. But the most important battle, at least in the north, was not Trenton, but Saratoga. This was a major defeat for the British, and while it's often put forth as an example of the superiority of the continental fighting man, the British mostly lost because of terrible generaling. The French would eventually bankrupt themselves helping us, which would lead to their own revolution. As thanks, we named our most important food after them. In the south, the country-city trend continued, with the British taking Charleston, but then continuing to lose smaller-scale battles and be harassed by guerrilla-style tactics. The key battle of the war in the south, because it was the one where the British surrendered, was at Yorktown in 1781. Lord Cornwallis made the brilliant tactical decision to station his troops on a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water filled with French ships, and the British lost the war. So what did this all mean for actual people? Well, Americans like to think that we all pitched in together and got rid of British tyranny and lived happily ever after. Also, that the Continental Army was the bravest, most loyal, and most effective fighting force in human history thanks to the leadership of George Washington. But actually, well, yeah, let's go to the thought bubble. Morale among Continental soldiers was often pretty low. Rations were poor and soldiers went unpaid. As Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier from Connecticut, wrote, they felt they were starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us. And many other colonists didn't fight for independence, they fought with the British. Others were pacifists, like the Quakers, who often had their property confiscated when they refused to fight. And in colonial America, of course, losing property also meant losing rights. And for slaves, the so-called fight for freedom was very different than it was for Continental soldiers, because loyalty to Britain in the war could mean freedom. In 1775, British Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that granted freedom to any slave who deserted his master and fought for the British. Something like 5,000 slaves took him up on the offer. And in addition, many slaves saw the revolution as a chance to escape. Boston King left a cruel master and later wrote, I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before. 100,000 slaves are estimated to have fled to the British. Now, many slaves were returned to their masters, but more than 15,000 left the U.S. when the British did. And it's worth remembering that the British Empire abolished slavery in all of its territory by 1843, and without a civil war. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Native Americans were also profoundly affected by the Revolutionary War. Generally, they wanted to stay out of it, and the colonists mostly wanted them to remain neutral too. Like the Continental Congress was eager to remind the Iroquois of their history of neutrality, writing, this is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep. Right, well, many of the Iroquois fought for the British anyway. The Oneidas joined the Patriots fighting against the Iroquois. Sometimes there were divisions within tribes themselves. Like with the Cherokees, younger chiefs tended to side with the British, older ones with the Americans. And it should be mentioned that, unsurprisingly, American troops were particularly brutal to American Indians who fought for the British, burning their villages and enslaving prisoners contrary to the accepted rules of war. And if the American Revolution was really about, as Thomas Jefferson would have it, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then the Indians were definitely the losers because they didn't get any of those rights. So we know slaves and Native Americans didn't get much out of the Revolutionary War. How did it go for women? Yeah, not great. Some colonial women fought in the war. Deborah Sampson dressed as a man and fought at several battles, once even pulling a bullet out of her own leg. But women didn't get much out of the Revolution. They were basically still considered wards of their husbands, or if they were unmarried, saleable assets of their fathers. However, the idea of Republican motherhood became really important. It held that for the Republic to survive, it was necessary to have a well-educated citizenry. And since women were the primary educators, they themselves needed to be educated so they could, to quote founding father Benjamin Rush, instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government, but not vote or own property. So the war didn't end slavery, it didn't much change the roles of women, and it didn't displace the elite land land-owning, pasty, white guy leadership of America. So what was revolutionary? Well, the ideas, a lot of which are summed up in a single sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when the colonies became states, they all created constitutions which opened voting to more people. While most states still had property qualifications for voting, the bar was lowered, so there were far more voters than there had been, although they were mostly white and male. But still, another aspect of the American Revolution that was pretty revolutionary was the beginning of true religious freedom. Like with independence, the Church of England ceased to be the Church of America. And some founders, like Thomas Jefferson, were deists, believing that God had created the world but then stepped away to create other universes or try to build a boulder too big for him to lift. Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state that's best embodied in the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia, which Jefferson was so proud of that he had it mentioned on his tombstone. And the American Revolution profoundly changed the economy too. All these new ideas of liberty led to a decline in apprenticeship and indentured servitude, and immediately after the war you began to see the split between the North with its reliance on paid labor and the South with its reliance on slavery. Slavery was actually on the decline in the South until Eli Whitney went and invented the cotton gin in 1793, which A, made it possible to turn a profit growing inferior American cotton, and B, reinvigorated slavery. Yay, innovation. Oh no, it's time for the mystery document. The rules are simple. Mystery document, get it wrong. Shock pen, get it right. Woo! An equality of property, constantly operating to destroy combinations of powerful families, is the very soul of a republic. While this continues, the people will inevitably possess both power and freedom. When this is lost, power departs, liberty expires, and a commonwealth will inevitably assume some other form. Let the people have property, and they will have power, a power that will forever be exerted to prevent a restriction of the press and the abolition of trial by jury or the abridgment of any other privilege. Stan, why did you put communism in my mystery document? All right, so we got a fan of wealth distribution, but it isn't Marx because A, he's not American, B, he wasn't born. There were a bunch of far-left hippies in early America with their hemp growing and their liberty espousing. Oh, I hate the shock pen. All right, I'm gonna guess that it is noted lexicographer Noah Webster. Yes! 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 Nailed it! Yes! Stan, that was the best one ever. That was my biggest victory to date. So it's worth remembering that some early Americans proposed a vision of liberty that sprung out of the idea of equality of property, which is very different from the way we imagine liberty today. But ideas of liberty, as diverse as they were, are really at the heart of what makes the American Revolution revolutionary. And that brings us back to slavery. The most common complaint among American high school students is that the revolution was deeply hypocritical. I mean, how could this guy write that all men were created equal when he himself held slaves and had kids with one of them? And even crazier, American colonists often referred to themselves as slaves because they were denied the right to have a vote in Parliament about their taxation. Now, some people recognize that it was a smidge hypocritical to claim to be enslaved by British taxation, while they themselves were actually enslaving people. But very few made the leap to say that liberty should mean freedom for the slaves. One exception was James Otis of Massachusetts, who wrote concerning America's slaves that unless they were free, there could be no liberty. What man is or ever was born free, if every man is not? But most of the founders, including this guy and this guy, were the cream of the colonial elites, and so they held slaves and made arguments against abolition. Like many historians now argue that Jefferson was trying to condemn slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but without slavery, he wouldn't have had his amazing life. I mean, if he'd been working, he couldn't have designed Monticello or stolen all those ideas from John Locke. And speaking of Locke, Locke equated liberty with property, and a revolution based on securing property against tyranny couldn't very well turn around and take slaves, who after all were considered property. I mean, Jefferson once calculated that his slaves gave him a better financial return than his real estate investments. That being said, there were many and frequent protests against slavery. The most vociferous protesters were often African Americans, and in the northern states at least, their pleas were heard. Between 1777 and 1804, all states north of Maryland got rid of slavery, although most did so at a very slow pace and were careful not to deprive slave owners owners of the value of their property. Like, as late as 1830, there were still about 3,500 slaves in the North, and on the eve of the Civil War, there were still 18 in New Jersey. New Jersey! So the number of free people of color in the U.S. skyrocketed. There were fewer than 10,000 in 1776. By 1810, there were nearly 200,000 free black Americans. So in the end, real change came, as it usually does, not through a revolutionary event, but through a revolutionary process. To me, the really novel idea that emerged from the American Revolution was of American equality. Now, obviously, this was and remains a vastly unequal social order, but I'm talking about the kind of equality that Gordon Wood described in his famous book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. The idea that no one American is inherently better than any other. Prior to the Revolution, and certainly in Europe, there were definite classes of superior people, usually determined by birth. I mean, people knew their place and they were expected to be deferential to their betters. But all that talk of freedom and inalienable rights introduced the idea that birth wasn't destiny and that all people should be treated with respect. And the idea that no one should be denied the opportunity to succeed because of who their parents were catalyzed change not just in America, but around the world. And while the US no longer leads in equality of opportunity, that early American idea that we are all equal in our capacity to reason and to work became the foundation not just for the American Revolution, but for many others that would come afterward. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller, edited by Stan and Mark Olson. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video, good news. There are historians waiting for you in comments, so ask away. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other countries stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. No, Stan, not the Libertage. Cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. All right, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In two words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Ah, supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation: Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course world history fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must, and the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, a fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farms. This was called Shays' Rebellion, after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and Senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Yes, I know, you have fantastic elections in Canada. Yeah, right, okay, all that too. I get it. Okay, it's U.S. history, Thought Bubble. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a 2-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. New Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us 2 houses. A House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though of course they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for for the calculation.
So, yeah,
That's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced two principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise, you can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state governments. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in congresspeople or, God forbid, a president in favor of, like, redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be like leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned Electoral College, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than, like, the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, the nation-state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I name the author of the mystery document, shock as in surprise. If I don't, shock as in All right, Stan, let's see what we got here. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Yes! Too easy, Stan, although I appreciate the opportunity for a rant. The whole idea of the Second Amendment was that the people could protect themselves from a standing army by being equally well armed. Which these days would mean not that citizens should have the right to buy assault rifles, but that they should have the right to buy, like, unmanned drones. And arguably suitcase nukes. And by the way, in the Constitution, this is not listed as a privilege, it is listed as a right. And as a right, if I can't afford my own Predator drone, I guess the government should buy one for me. It's almost as if Alexander Hamilton had no way of knowing that weaponry would one day advance past the musket. P.S. You know how Alexander Hamilton died? Gunshot! Sorry, I had to. I am on a roll. So it would be easy to ignore the people who opposed the Constitution because, you know, they lost. But some of the ideas of these so-called anti-federalists were particularly powerful, and they deserve a bit of attention. Anti-federalists, unlike the mostly wealthy federalists, were usually supported by common people, small farmers who weren't as involved in commercial activity. They saw less need for a strong national government that would foster trade and protect creditors. And the anti-federalists were very afraid of a strong government, especially one dominated by the wealthy. Writers like James Winthrop held that a large group of United States would be like an empire, and that no extensive empire can be governed upon republican principles. As evidence, he could point to Britain, or all the way back to Rome. Smaller, more local governments are more responsive to the people and better able to protect their rights. To the anti-federalists, that meant state governments. And while ultimately the Federalists won out and the Constitution was ratified, the issue of how large government should be did not go away. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process and then on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, edited by Stan and Mark Olson. The associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video or anything about American history, good news, there are historians in comments, so ask away. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today you aren't going to get a blow-by-blow chronology of the American Revolution, and you aren't going to get cool biographical details about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, but you are going to get me not wearing any pants. Mr. Green, did you know that George Washington might have had slave teeth implanted into his jaw? Yeah, I did, me from the past, and while it's fun to focus on metaphorically resonant details, what we're concerned with here is why the American Revolution happened and the extent to which it was actually revolutionary. Plus, for the first time in Crash Course history, I have a legitimate chance of getting through an entire episode without butchering a single pronunciation. Unfortunately, next week we will be in France, and je parle français comme un idiote. So intellectual historians might put the roots of the American Revolution earlier, but I'm going to start with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which, as you will recall from last week, was 1, expensive, and 2, a victory for the British, including British subjects living in America who now had more land and therefore more money. Right, so in 1765, the British government was like, hey, since we went into this debt to get you all this new land, we trust that you won't mind if we pass the Stamp Act, in which we place a fancy stamp on your documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc., and in return, you give us money. Well, it turns out the colonists weren't so keen on this, not so much because the tax was high, but because they had no direct representation in the parliament that had levied the tax. And plus, they were cranky about the crown keeping large numbers of British troops in the colonies even after the end of the 7 Years' War. And then the British government was like, you are inadequately grateful, and the colonists were like, shut up, we hate you, and the British government was like, as long as you live under our roof, you live by our rules, and so on. But eventually, the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal inspired a line of commemorative teapots, thereby beginning America's storied tradition of worthless collectible ceramics. But in the end, this only emboldened the colonists when the British tried to put new taxes on the Americans in the form of the Townshend Act. These led to further protests and boycotts, and most importantly, more organization among the colonists. The protests escalated. 1770 saw the Boston Massacre, which with its sum total of 5 dead was perhaps the least massacre of all time. And in 1773, a bunch of colonists dumped about $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of British government decisions that actually would have made British tea cheaper. Oh, it's time for the open letter? Ow! Oh, that did not go well. An open letter to tea. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a gigantic tea bag. Let's see what flavor it is. Bitter tyranny variety. Dear T, like all Americans who love justice and freedom, I hate you. But I understand you're quite popular in the UK, where the East India Company would periodically go to war for you. But what fascinates me about you, T, I mean, aside from the fact that people choose to drink you when there are great American refreshments available like Mountain Dew, is that even though you're stereotypically English, you're not English. It's Chinese or Burmese or Indian, no one really knows, but it's definitely not English. You didn't even have tea until like the 1660s. Posers. Best wishes, John Green. So the Boston Tea Party led to further British crackdowns, and then mobilization of colonial militias, and then Paul Revere, and then actual war. But you can hear all about that stuff on like TV miniseries. I want to focus on one of the ways that colonists protested unfair taxation. Let's go to the thought bubble. As previously noted, the English crown benefited tremendously from the import of consumer goods to the American colonies, and one of the most effective ways American colonists could protest taxation without representation was by boycotting British products. In order to enforce these boycotts, the protesters created committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and was not observing the boycotts, and these committees also could coerce non-compliers into compliance, which is to say that they were creating and enforcing policy. Kind of like a government does. The Maryland Committee of Correspondence, in fact, was instrumental in setting up the First Continental Congress, which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775. This was back when Congresses did things, by the way. It was awesome. Anyway, the Continental Congress is most famous for drafting and approving the Declaration of Independence. No, thought bubble, that's the Will Smith vehicle, Independence Day. I mean the Declaration of Independence. Right, that one. It's not your fault. You guys are Canadian. You've never declared independence. Worth noting, by the way, that the Congress edited out more than a quarter of Jefferson's original declaration, and he forever after insisted that they'd, quote, mangled it. Anyway, I would argue the heavy lifting of the American Revolution was already done by the Declaration. In truth, by the time the shooting started, most of the colonists were already self-governing and had developed a sense of themselves as something separate and different from Great Britain, as evidenced by these committees of correspondence, which functioned as shadow governments, eventually reaching out to foreign governments, establishing an espionage network, tarring and feathering loyalists and royal officials, which, by the way, is incredibly painful and dangerous to the victim, and even recruiting physicians to tell American men that drinking British tea would make them weak and effeminate. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, despite all this, about 20% of colonists remained loyal to Great Britain throughout the war, especially in the major cities that Britain occupied. Also, lots of slaves continued to support the British, especially after Britain promised that any slaves who fought with them would be freed. And it's worth noting that while we generally celebrate the Revolution and see it as a step toward justice and equality, the people who most needed the protection of a government might have been better off and more free if Britain had won, especially since Britain ended slavery well before America did and, without a civil war. Also, even though most Americans had come to see themselves as separate from Britain before 1776, the British certainly didn't see it that way. They continued to fight either until 1781 or 1783, depending on whether you calculate by when they actually gave up or when the peace treaty was signed. So you can't really say the American Revolution was won before the fighting even started, but the truth is the American Revolution and the War for Independence weren't like this. They were like this. So here's what was pretty revolutionary about the American Revolution. The colonists threw off the rule of an imperial monarchy and replaced it with a government that didn't have a king, a radical idea in a world that didn't feature many non-monarchical forms of government. And if you look at the explanations for the revolution, especially those contained in the Declaration of Independence and in pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, there's definitely a revolutionary zeal that's informed by the Enlightenment. And that's especially true if you focus on the idea of liberty, as many of the pamphleteers did. That said, if you look at the actual outcome of the revolution, aside from the whole no king thing, it wasn't that revolutionary. Let's look, for instance, at two ideas central to the revolution: property rights and equality. So the Articles of Confederation gave the government no power to tax, which had the effect of making sure that people who had property were able to keep it because they never had to pay the government anything in exchange for the right to own and use it. And that's very different from taxation systems dating all the way back to Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And it's probably not a coincidence that most of the writers and signers of the Declaration of Independence were men of property. And they wanted to keep it that way. So basically, the white guys who controlled the land and its production before the American Revolution were the same white guys who controlled it after the American Revolution. And this leads us to the second and more important way that as a revolution, the American one falls a bit short. So if you've ever studied American history, you're probably familiar with the greatest line in the Declaration of Independence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Sorry, ladies. And you also may know that at the time those words were written, a large segment of the American population, perhaps as much as 30%, were slaves of African descent who were held as property and were definitely 100% not treated as equal to whites. In fact, the guy who wrote those words held slaves and was fighting against a government who promised to free any slaves who supported it. Furthermore, women couldn't vote, and neither could white men who didn't own enough property, meaning that the government of, for, and by the people was in fact of, for, and by about 10 to 15% of the people. But here's the real question. Was the American Revolution what the historian Jonathan Israel called a revolution of mind? Did it change the way we think about what people are and how we should organize ourselves? Addressing those questions will involve a brief foray into the history of ideas. Let's study the Enlightenment! The Enlightenment was primarily a celebration of humans' ability to understand and improve the natural world through reason. The Enlightenment had a number of antecedents, including the European Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution, but what made it special was that some of its more radical proponents, like Immanuel Kant for instance, went so far as to argue that human reason rendered a belief in God unnecessary, and by extension proclaimed that any belief in divine intervention or a divine plan for humanity was just superstition. Given that this was coming out of an overwhelmingly Christian Europe, this was a pretty controversial suggestion, and not all Enlightenment thinkers would go that far. And more moderate Enlightenment thinkers were also more willing to countenance hierarchical social and political structures. Like John Locke, a major Enlightenment thinker, formulated his version of inalienable rights as life, liberty, and property. And that's much more traditional than arguing, for instance, that property should be held communally. And it's no coincidence that the more moderate Enlightenment thinkers, like Locke and Adam Smith, happened to be British, and the real radicals were French. And the founders of the United States were far more closely linked to those British Enlightenment thinkers than to the French, who influenced the French Revolution, which, as we will see next week, goes swimmingly. But even if the government that America's revolutionaries came up with didn't overturn privilege or tear apart the social order as the French Revolution tried to do, it did make significant changes. America made sure that there would never be a formal nobility, except for the Count of Chocula, and it recognized the equal rights of daughters and widows when it came to inheriting and possessing property. Also, it created a world in which future countesses could rehabilitate their reputations in New York. But the real seismic change was that after the Revolution, Americans came to view themselves as equal to each other. And in the context of the 18th century, that was pretty radical. Ordinary Americans came to believe that no one in a basic, down-to-earth and day-in and day-out manner was really better than anyone else. That was equality as no other nation had ever quite had it. And in the end, the ideas of the American Revolution, ideas about property and equality and representation, are still hugely important in shaping political discourse around the world, and particularly in America. And by America, I mean the United States. I'm sorry, Canadians and Mexicans and Central Americans and South Americans. We're provincial, okay? I mean, here in the United States, our presidential candidates must both know how to wear a suit and how to bowl. But the American Revolution also reminds us, as the French one will next week, that revolutionary ideas and values are not always easy to live up to. Nothing challenges one's belief in equality quite like becoming rich and powerful. Indeed, rare is the revolutionary who doesn't become on some level like Orwell's pigs, insisting that while all animals were created equal, some were created more equal than others. In short, if you're going to base your new society on philosophy, you should try to found it on ideals that are as inclusive and humanistic as possible, because the people executing those ideas will never be ideal. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher Raoul Meyer and myself. Our graphics team is Thought Bubble, and we are ably interned by Meredith Danko. Last week's phrase of the week was Historian Feuds. If you want to suggest future phrases of the week or guess at this one, you can do so in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
When we're talking about major wars in colonial North America, we tend to think about the American Revolution, not its earlier iteration, the 7 Years' War. And I think that's a shame, because the 7 Years' War was incredibly influential, not only on the American Revolution, but on the complexion of the world. Thanks to the 7 Years' War, Canada became a British country, not a French country. The Acadians moved down to Louisiana and became known as the Cajuns. And most importantly, England became the world's preeminent empire. So if you've been following along this far, you may have noticed two things. One, that the people who named this war seem to be very bad at math, because 1754 to 1763 is 9 years, not 7. And that this war seems to have two names, both the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, which is a name you perhaps have heard before. Well, let me tackle those two oddities in reverse order. So not only does the 7 Years' War have two names, it has a whole number of names. It's called the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the War of the Conquest, the Pomeranian War, the Third Silesian War, the Third Carnatic War. This is a war with a whole bunch of names, and the reason that it has a whole bunch of names is that it was fought in a whole bunch of places. The 7 Years' War was really the first global war, and we're talking 150 years before World War I. Aspects of the 7 Years' War, as you can kind of see from this map, were fought in Europe, in South America, the coasts of Africa, in India, the Philippines, and, of course, in North America. The many different names come from the many different fronts of this war. And I would say that French and Indian War is actually the name for the North American front of this war, or theater of this war. So there are two reasons why I think 7 Years' War is a better name than French and Indian War. One is that 7 Years' War gets at the idea that it was not just happening in North America. It was happening all over the world, so it shows that it was a global war. But I also think 7 Years' War is a better name than French and Indian War because I think French and Indian War is kind of confusing because you would think that it means that the principal parties in this war were the English versus the French and the Indians, when in fact it was the English and their Indian allies versus the French and their Indian allies. Native Americans fought on both sides of this conflict. So rather than the English and Indian versus French and Indian War, let's go with the shorter 7 Years' War. Which brings us back to our awkward date range. So the reason that it's called the 7 Years' War is because the English didn't actually declare war on the French until 1756. So even though fighting started a little bit earlier in North America, the true range of dates, at least in legal terms, is from 1756 to 1763, or 7 years. It's a complicated name for a complicated war, but really what it came down to was England and France duking it out over who was going to be the supreme imperial power in the world. And they were concerned about who was going to have the most territory in the world. Therefore, their concern over who was going to control North America in their competing claims here, and also access to trade. So who was going to be able to trade with North Americans? Who was going to be able to trade with the lucrative Indian subcontinent? And who would be the leading power in Europe? So let's dial in a little closer on the North American theater of this war, which will have the most effect on the future United States. All right, so here is a map of territorial claims by European powers in North America before the 7 Years' War. Now you can see that there are some places where they overlap, which is really going to be the heart of the problem in this conflict. So England, shown here in red, I'm going to outline it a bit, was, as you know from your early American history, here along the eastern seaboard of what's today the United States, and also up into Canada. France claimed this interior region of Canada and today the territorial United States. And Spain was in the mix here. Remember, Spain has still been a fairly influential colonial power in Florida and in contemporary Mexico, and also down here in Cuba and South America. All right, so we've got 3 major European powers in the mix here in North America: England, France, and Spain. But what this map doesn't show is the American Indian powers who are also in this area. So most of this region, really west of the Appalachian Mountains, is Indian country. And the majority of inhabitants were Native Americans, and they really held the majority of power in this region as well. So major Native American groups that are in play in this conflict are the Iroquois Confederacy, and also Cherokees, Hurons, Algonquins, Abenakis, and Micmacs. And that's just a small sampling. So you can see that there are a number of important Native American tribes who are specifically in this area of Canada, which is disputed, and also living in the greater Appalachian region. So what does each of these groups want? Well, England definitely wants territory. They want to make sure that their English settlers along the eastern seaboard, whom we'll soon be calling Americans, have room to expand. The French want to make sure that they still have access to trade with Native Americans because their main concern is fur, which is a very valuable commodity in Europe. And Spain wants to make sure that they have access to their sugar islands and also their precious metals in the Caribbean and in South America. Now, it's worth noting, because I think this is really interesting to students of American history, that all of this territory, all of North America, was way less valuable than all of this territory. Because we're not talking about just value in land, we're talking about value in commodities. And what the Caribbean had was sugar. And sugar is the most valuable crop in this time period. So a tiny island down here in the Bahamas is probably worth more to a European power than the entire interior of North America. And what do these Native American groups want? Well, some of them want help with revenge on each other. Many other smaller Native American groups have been displaced by the Iroquois, who are here in upstate New York, kind of Quebec region. So the Iroquois is actually expanding and really defending their claim as the largest Native American empire. But the other thing that they want is to make sure that their territory is no longer encroached upon by English settlers in particular. Now, one mistake I see early students of U.S. history making is thinking that all Native Americans kind of shared a cultural and political bond, right? That they saw themselves as one larger people who had to unite against the encroachment of Europeans. And that was definitely not the case. Native Americans had been living in this territory for thousands of years, and they had enemies and beef with other groups that went back way longer than the arrival of Europeans in North America. So when nations like England and France arrived with their weapons and their trade goods, the American Indians didn't look at each other and say, oh, wait, now we're all one race. We need to join together against the encroachment of whites. They saw England and France and Spain as possible avenues to getting one up on their older enemies. So when an English trader sold a gun to, say, a Huron, he was way more likely to go after, say, the Iroquois with that gun than he was to go after a French trader. So another reason why the 7 Years' War is a better name for the French and Indian War than French and Indian War is because these Native American groups did not ally all with France. In fact, the Iroquois and Cherokee ended up allied with England, and most of the other Native American groups ended up allied with France. But they were fighting each other in addition to fighting England. All right, so the stage is set for this conflict with all of these competing groups in this unclear territory, and how this turns into a war we'll get to in the next video. So we've been discussing the 7 Years' War in North America, also commonly called the French and Indian War, but as I mentioned in the last video, I think 7 Years' War is a better name for this conflict because it was the first global war that happened more than 150 years before World War I. And this global war was, at its heart, about who would be the dominant empire in the world. Would it be England or would it be France? Now, in the North American theater of this war, England, France, and their Native American allies on both sides were vying for territory, and particularly territory along the Appalachian Mountain Range in upstate New York, Canada, this kind of western territory that was the border between the English settlement and Indian country to the west. So in this video, let's talk about how the war actually progressed and what its consequences were for North America and later the United States. All right, so we've got the English, the French, and a number of Native American tribes all kind of jostling for position in North America. Now, what stresses the British out the most is the presence of the French in the Ohio River Valley. Both the British and the French have laid claim to this territory. And they're both eager to strengthen their territorial claims by building forts and otherwise having a show of possession of the area. They argue over who had a presence there first. So to establish the English presence in the Ohio River Valley, the English send a young officer named George Washington to build a fort. George Washington is only 22 years old at the time. And he and his men go out to this area and they run into some French with their Native American allies at Fort Duquesne, which is where the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers come together, which is today Pittsburgh. So George Washington and his allies get the jump on the French, but that doesn't last very long. They're overpowered and they fall back and establish Fort Necessity on account of it was necessary. And they managed to hold out for a little while, but eventually the French, the Canadians, and their Native American allies force Washington to surrender, and he goes back to Virginia. So that's 1754. And we'll call that fail number 1. All right, so then a year later, 1755, the British try to displace the French from Fort Duquesne once again, and they send Major General Edward Braddock with George Washington, once again, now he's 23, back to Fort Duquesne, and it's a complete disaster. This time, the French and their Indian allies get the drop on the English, and with a much smaller force, completely decimate the English troops. And Braddock is killed, and George Washington has to take command of the retreat. So that's fail number 2. In general, this war does not go terribly well for the British at the beginning, except in one area, Acadia, where the British managed to attain control and they kick out the French settlers, the Acadians, who are transported down to the French settlement of New Orleans in Louisiana, where eventually their name becomes garbled and they're known as the Cajuns. Not the Acadians, but the Cajuns. In 1756, England finally gets around to actually declaring war on France. But it's really not for another year that the war starts to actually go well in 1757. And the reason that the war starts going well for the English, finally, is that the Prime Minister, William Pitt, decides that he is going to pour money into this endeavor. So he thinks that the English have just not had enough men, materials, money, Indian allies up until this point. So he is really going to commit the British Empire to exiling the French from this area of North America. So between 1757 and 1760, things really start looking up for the British. They finally capture Fort Duquesne, and they capture the Ohio Valley, Nova Scotia, upstate New York, and Quebec. So by 1760, pretty much all the fighting is done in North America. The English have more or less forced the French out of the eastern seaboard and Canada. And in 1763, the English and the French sit down to hammer out the Treaty of Paris. So the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and I apologize, I cannot help the fact that there are like a million treaties of Paris. There's also the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. There's the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War. Paris was the place where you made treaties, and they're all called the Treaty of Paris, but this is the one that happened in 1763. In general, this was a big victory for the English. The English not only got most of France's possessions in the New World, they got New France, aka Canada. They got Spanish Florida. Spain was fighting on the side of France, so they lose that. They got a bunch of sugar islands in the Caribbean. And they pretty much got recognized as the premier power in Europe and the premier imperial power. So the largest and most powerful empire in the world. And let's not forget that the colonial Americans, citizens of Massachusetts and New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, they were on the winning side here. They fought alongside the British regulars. They repelled the French and their Native American allies. This was actually a pretty big confidence boost for young America. But there were some other consequences of this war. On the not-so-good side, the 7 Years' War was not particularly good for Native Americans in general, both those who had allied with the British and those who had allied with the French. They no longer had two imperial powers vying against each other in North America that they could play off of each other. Now, Native Americans were only dealing with the British, who certainly were not giving them a fair seat at the table. Not long after the 7 Years' War, they will institute what's called the Proclamation of 1763, which was basically a boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains, saying that that was going to be the end of white settlement, that they would reserve all the lands west of the Appalachians for Native Americans. Well, you can imagine how much the American white settlers respected that, which is to say they completely ignored this boundary line. So the Native Americans will continue to be pushed farther west. and to develop more of what we call a race consciousness. The idea that they were all in one big group together who had to combine forces to repel English settlement. The other major outcome of the 7 Years' War was taxation. Remember that William Pitt won the 7 Years' War by pouring money into it. At the end of the 7 Years' War, England is in a lot of debt, and they have just gone to a lot of trouble to protect their North American interests. Now, as they are looking for ways to make revenue to make up the deficit the 7 Years' War has placed on them, they look at their North American colonists and say, you should pay your way. And the American colonists, who have been used to more than a century of called salutary or benign neglect, are shocked and outraged that the British Empire is now clamping down on them. And the colonists' reaction to those new taxes will propel the colonies into revolution. On July 4th, 1776, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. And we know parts of it very well. For example, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence was really the point of no return for the young United States of America, making an appeal to the rest of the world to say that their time as a colony of the United Kingdom had ended. Now, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence was this man here, Thomas Jefferson. I tried to find a picture of him as a young man. In fact, at the time, he was about 10 years younger than you even see him here. He was 33. So where did young Thomas Jefferson get all of the ideas that he expressed in the Declaration of Independence? And what happened to those ideas once he put them down on paper? In this video, I'd like to explore some of the origins and effects of the Declaration of Independence. Now, we often think that the Revolutionary War started with the Declaration of Independence. We think of 1776 as being this opening moment of the revolution. In fact, parts of the Revolutionary War had been going on for some time. It was in 1765, more than a decade earlier, that some of the first unrest over taxation, specifically the Stamp Act, had begun. In 1773, the famous Boston Tea Party, when a group of colonists dumped over 300 crates of tea into Boston Harbor, had happened. And in 1775, over a year before the Declaration of Independence, the first shots of the Revolutionary War had taken place outside Boston at the towns of Lexington and Concord. So by the time the delegates had met in Philadelphia, the Revolutionary War had been a shooting war for more than a year. So why was it that in July of 1776, the delegates finally made the Declaration of Independence? Well, the primary reason that they did it at this time was because they wanted help. And they were particularly eager to get the assistance of the nation of France, which had been a long-time enemy of the United Kingdom. And the delegates really knew that the new United States of America would have no hope of winning a war against a massive imperial power like Great Britain without the help of another world power such as France. So in a way, what Jefferson was doing in the Declaration of Independence wasn't so much declaring, but rather explaining why the states were declaring themselves independent with the hope that they could get the sympathy and the help of the international community. So let's read some of the Declaration of Independence. And I know that this is a gigantic block of text here, but bear with me, we'll go through it fairly quickly. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And you'll notice here that he specifically points out that there are 13 United States. And this is important because it gives you a sense that they aren't really thinking of the individual former colonies, now states, as one larger country, but rather as a collection of states, a confederation of allied states, instead of a single nation. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So here's this explanation part, saying, we feel it necessary to explain why we want to separate from Great Britain. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So I think this might be the most important passage of the Declaration of Independence, and let me tell you why. In this paragraph, you can really see the influence of the Enlightenment on Jefferson's thought. Now, the Enlightenment was a period in the 1600s and 1700s when people began to explore scientific observation and reason. They became more interested in observing the world around them and trying to make reasoned arguments from what they saw, as compared to accepting the religious explanations for how the world worked. And during the Enlightenment, many philosophers began to rethink government as well, kind of questioning whether the governmental system in Europe and other places was the right system. There was one philosopher in particular who really captured Jefferson's imagination, and his name was John Locke. So John Locke was an English philosopher who had lived in the 1600s, and he wrote a book that had really influenced Jefferson and many thinkers in this time period called Two Treatises on Government. And there were two really important points in Locke's work. One was the idea of natural rights. And what Locke meant by natural rights are rights that were endowed by nature, that all people were born with. Now, if you think about Europe in this time period, there was a sense that some people were born with more rights than others. In fact, there was the idea of the divine right of kings, that the king or monarch of any sort had been born the king because God wanted that person to rule. Well, Locke rejects that. He says, when people are born, they're all born the same, and they all have rights that can't be given away, that are unalienable, and those are life, liberty, and property. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Now, the other important idea that Locke had is the idea of the social contract. The idea of the social contract was that government came from the people, that society members got together and agreed on what the forms of government should be, so that the only just government was one that took into account the opinions of the people who live within it. You see that here too. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And there's a third thing that Locke suggests that Jefferson also gets at, which is that when governments become tyrannical, when they do not abide by the social contract, it is the right of the people to rebel. All right, back to the Declaration. So most of the rest of the Declaration is just a list of grievances of what the king has done to the colonies that has made them very angry. And this is an extremely abridged list of them. I highly recommend you read the entire Declaration because I think it gives you a really good sense of what the colonists were thinking at this time period. But here are some of the highlights. Jefferson says that the king has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. So those are the British regulars who've been stationed in North America for a long time. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This is the Navigation Acts that said that the colonies could only trade with Great Britain. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. The idea of taxation without representation, which really motivated the colonists to rebel. And so forth and so on. Now, it's worth noting that the Declaration of Independence, as an explanation hoping to get France on the side of the new United States, worked very well. The United States allied with France, which led them to win the Revolutionary War in 1783. But as we close, it's worth pondering what it was that Thomas Jefferson really meant by the phrase, all men are created equal. The Revolutionary War didn't abolish slavery in the United States. In fact, Jefferson himself owned over 100 enslaved people of African descent. So when Jefferson said all men are created equal, was he thinking only of all white men? Was he thinking only of elite white men? After all, after the Revolution, only a handful of propertied elite men could vote. But then there's this larger idea here. He's saying that your ordinary man wasn't born any different than someone who was born a king. So why should someone who was born black be different than someone who was born white? It's hard to imagine how Jefferson separated those things in his mind. Certainly others at the time period realized that there was an inherent contradiction between slavery and also between the rights of women and the idea that all men are created equal. Over time, the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence would go on to spur many different movements for independence and civil rights, the most notable of which being the French Revolution, which took much of its rhetoric from the American Revolution. And later, in 1848, the first women's rights movement would gather at Seneca Falls, New York, and release what they called the Declaration of Sentiments, which began, all men and women are created equal. So Jefferson's ideas here are both deeply radical, insisting that ordinary people are just as good as kings and even more entitled to decide their own form of government. But that revolution only went so far. It didn't change much about the status of everyday citizens in the United States. But it put forward an ideal which we've been working toward ever since. During the American Revolution, everyone became a little bit of a philosopher. Walking down the street in Boston, past coffee houses and taverns, you might hear ordinary people debating equality and natural rights. Before it was even a political revolution, the American Revolution was a revolution of ideas. You see these ideas all over the literature of the time period. Perhaps most famously in Thomas Jefferson's language in the Declaration that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights. The idea that everyone has the natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You would see it in the most famous slogan of the Revolution, "No taxation without representation." The idea that the people should have a say in the laws that affect them. The Revolution even went so far as to criticize the idea of monarchy, which pamphleteer Thomas Paine called absurd. These ideas criticized long-standing social norms about who deserved to rule versus who deserved to be ruled. It's likely that most of the founders thought these ideas primarily applied to the political struggle between the colonies and Great Britain. But it wasn't just elite white men who considered these radical notions and thought about how to apply them to their own lives. These revolutionary ideals increased the awareness of inequalities in society more broadly and caused some people to call for changes in voting rights, in the institution of slavery, and the status of women. One major change that the revolutionary ideals caused was an expansion of political democracy in state governments. So after the revolution, all the states wrote new constitutions, and every one of them instituted a representative government through an elected legislature. And almost all of them also reduced the property requirements for voting and office holding, which previously had limited the franchise to wealthier white men. After the revolution, a majority of white men had the right to vote, and voting rights would continue to expand until all white men had the right to vote by the 1830s. In fact, some state constitutions, like New Jersey's, didn't specify who could vote so long as they met the new lower property requirements. So between the Revolution and 1807, when they changed the law, property-owning women and free people of color could vote. Another social change that was brought on by these revolutionary ideals was the emergence of the abolition movement to end the practice of slavery. So almost all of the founders were slave owners, and they didn't seem to notice any contradiction between the idea that all men are created equal and keeping Africans in perpetual bondage. But that did not mean that others missed the connection. During the Revolution itself, many enslaved people escaped, filed petitions for freedom, or they joined the military to gain freedom on the side of the Americans, but more frequently on the side of the British, who offered freedom in exchange for serving in the army. After the Revolution, northern states either abolished slavery or they began a process of gradual emancipation. So, saying that enslaved people who were children might remain in slavery until they were in their mid to late 20s, and then would be free, and their children would be free. So that over the course of the late 1800s and early 1900s, in most northern states, slavery was either entirely eliminated or phased out to the point that there was a very small enslaved population. Southern states did not abolish slavery in response to the Revolution, and this would continue to expand sectional tensions between the North and the South until the Civil War. The last change in social values that I want to discuss relates to women's role in the war. Women played a pretty crucial role in supporting the independence movement, and they also drew on the rhetoric of revolutionary ideas to support their claims for an improvement in status. Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, wrote to him while he was in Philadelphia working on the draft of the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson and others. She wrote, In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. In general, the revolution didn't result in a huge change of status for white women, and none at all for enslaved women. But one idea did emerge that would foment social change farther down the line, and that was the idea of Republican motherhood. So Republican motherhood was the notion that for this new democratic American nation to work, the country was going to need virtuous citizens. And who taught men how to be virtuous citizens? Their mothers. So thinkers of the time period, particularly a Philadelphia physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence named Benjamin Rush, argued that women should receive more robust education in order to better educate their sons. So instead of only learning household skills or etiquette, women should learn philosophy and mathematics. Now, while this concept was mainly in the service of improving the education and virtue of men, it did result in the expansion of women's education and the founding of new schools and colleges for girls. And many of the girls who attended those schools would go on to be major reformers and activists in the women's rights and abolitionist movements in the 19th century. I want to finish by just briefly taking a look at John Adams' response to his wife's letter encouraging him to remember the ladies, which is not nearly as famous as her letter, but I think still tells us a lot about the ideas of the time period. He said, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest were grown discontented." And there at the end, he's referring to women. You can tell that John kind of takes this as a joke. He can't imagine that the ideas that he and the other founders used so persuasively in the American Revolution would lead women and African Americans and working class people like apprentices to apply those same notions to themselves. But perhaps the joke was on John Adams, after all, because that is exactly what they did. Hey, this is Kim, and I'm here with Leah, Khan Academy's U.S. Government and Politics Fellow. Welcome, Leah.
How's it going?
All right, so we're talking about the Articles of Confederation, which I think many people don't realize was the first Constitution of the United States before the one that we have now since 1789. So could you take us through a little bit what the Articles of Confederation were and the context in which we first brought them on as a governmental system?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to understand about the Articles of Confederation and why we would talk about this is because one of the biggest debates that we have in our history is about the balance of power between the federal government and state governments. When the Articles of Confederation were first created, it was in the middle of the American Revolution. They were created in 1777. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, well, how can we run a government that looks as different from monarchy as possible?
Right, so they're trying to run away from the past that they're getting away from in the Revolutionary War and trying to create a separate government that doesn't have any of those abuses that they are rebelling against.
If they're running away from a monarchy, what they're running towards is what we would call a limited government.
Okay.
So their central government, which is synonymous with a federal government, the central government is actually really, really, really small. They don't have an executive branch. They only have Congress. They don't even have a judicial branch. So Congress is made up of all 13 states. Every state had one representative.
Okay.
In order to change the Articles of Confederation, if they wanted to pass an amendment, they had to get unanimous consent from all 13 states.
Okay, so they're trying to make sure that all of the states are represented equally, but
That also sounds like it would have a lot of hurdles to overcome when it comes to getting consensus.
Yeah, for laws, you had to get 9 out of 13 states to actually pass a law. So if you can imagine, if you're in a room of 13 people and you all have to agree on one pizza topping for the rest of your lives, it would be almost impossible, right?
Wow. Okay. All right. So it sounds like there are some problems with the Articles of Confederation, but did they do anything good for us in this early period?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is that it unites all 13 colonies and who are now states under one government.
Okay.
This government is able to pass a really favorable treaty with Britain and end the Revolutionary War in 1783, the Treaty of Paris.
Okay, so this is kind of the government that gets us through the Revolutionary War and is with us when we first start in the 1780s.
Yeah, and one other specific law that they pass is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this Northwest Ordinance kind of tells us how we are going to expand as we move west and what are we going to do with that land. And that's a really important idea when we're moving forward with our country. The only problem is with the Articles of Confederation is there is a lot of things that we still have to figure out as we're growing. There's a lot of growing pains.
So what led the early government of the United States to realize that they wanted to abandon these Articles of Confederation in favor of a different constitution?
So the inciting incident is Shays' Rebellion. It happens in Massachusetts, and it's a group of farmers led by this guy named Daniel Shays. What's happening is that we had just gotten out of the Revolutionary War, and a lot of the people who had fought in the Revolutionary War still hadn't gotten payment for their duty. They also were experiencing really high state taxes. So Daniel Shays and these farmers are very upset, obviously, and they're wanting their money, and so they start a rebellion. But the problem is with the way that the central government that was built, first, Congress had no ability to levy or collect taxes. If they couldn't collect taxes, they had no ability to actually pay back their farmers. Along with that, they didn't have any money to create a military. So each state had their own militia, but the United States as a whole, as a country, did not have a military to suppress this rebellion. So on both ends, we are in a really bad situation politically.
Wow, so there's this moment where you find armed rebellion against the United States for a lack of money, and the U.S. government finds that it can't raise money and it can't raise an army to put down this rebellion.
Exactly. And so there is this fear immediately. And what we see is a lot of the founding fathers that we know and really respect today, like George Washington and Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they get together and they say, this is a problem, we need to change what we have. And this leads to the Constitutional Convention, in which we draft our second constitution.
Right, yeah. So in 1787, the leaders of the United States get together and say, all right, the Articles of Confederation aren't working. We're going to need a stronger central government, even though we were trying to get away from the monarchy. And now let's think of something that's going to work a little bit better for us. In the United States today, we know our system of government so well that it hardly bears thinking about. We know that there's a president who's the head of the executive branch. There's Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And there's the judicial branch, which has the Supreme Court as its head of a whole court system that stretches throughout the United States. But how did the United States end up with this system? We frequently forget that the Constitutional Convention, which created this system we know today, happened in 1787. That was more than a decade after the Declaration of Independence. So there was this 11-year plus period before the United States had its modern-day constitution. And during that time, fought the Revolutionary War, won in 1783, and tried out a completely different system of government called the Articles of Confederation, which we talked a little bit more about in another video. Now, the Articles of Confederation had a very strong sense of limited government. In fact, you could think of the Articles of Confederation as being a little bit more like a loose confederation of states, where each state had one vote in the legislative branch, the branch that makes laws. And they had to really agree on most things. 9 out of 13 for most legislation, and unanimous agreement for any kind of amendments to this system. And I think it's clear why the founders first went with this system of limited government, because they had just revolted against a monarchy. They thought of the states as being in what they called just kind of a league of friendship. You could almost see it as being similar to the European Union today. Independent nations who do some things together for foreign policy reasons and economic reasons. But by the late 1780s, it was becoming clear that the Articles of Confederation were not working. With such a weak central government, it was really hard to get things done. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't raise a military. Some states were even putting taxes on the goods of other states. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island did not participate because Rhode Island was not a big fan of central government, came together in Philadelphia, in the same place where they had signed the Declaration of Independence, to think about how to revise the Articles of Confederation. And some very notable figures were there. George Washington was one of them. See Ben Franklin over here, and James Madison. Although some people that you might have expected to be at the Constitutional Convention were not, namely Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were out of the country being diplomats at the time. So the delegates at the Constitutional Convention have a pretty difficult problem to solve. They want to have a stronger central government, one that can get things done, make sure the states play well together, raise armies, raise taxes. But they don't want a central government that is too strong because they just escaped from monarchy. They don't want to recreate monarchy in the United States. So they're looking for a very delicate balance of a government strong enough to get things done, but not so strong as to promote tyranny. Now, even though the delegates were supposed to be revising the Articles of Confederation, some people had in secret been considering completely throwing out the Articles of Confederation and starting anew. But one of the biggest hurdles they had to solve was, what would a new sort of legislature look like? So the Virginia delegates suggested a plan for the legislature. It's the lawmaking body. That would be bicameral, means 2-room or 2-house, from bi, meaning 2, and camera, Latin for room. And their idea was that there would be a lower house, similar to the House of Commons in English Parliament, that would be directly elected. That is, individuals would vote for the representatives, but the number of representatives that each state would get would be decided by their population. Now, Virginia was the largest state by population by far, and so this plan would have worked out pretty well for them because they would have gotten the largest proportion of representatives. Small states like Delaware and Georgia, Rhode Island would have very few representatives indeed, comparatively. They also wanted to have an upper house, similar to the House of Lords in the British Parliament, which would be appointed by state legislatures. But just like the lower house, the number of representatives would also be determined by population. Now, as you can imagine, the small states were not big fans of having representation based just on population. So they came back with a different plan. This was called the New Jersey Plan. So the little states said, all right, the Virginia plan gives way too much power to the big states. We want an equal voice in legislation. So the New Jersey Plan, much like the Articles of Confederation, gave one vote to each of the states, so that the small states would have the same representation in Congress as the large states. And their plan was for a single chamber or a unicameral legislature. So this really wasn't much different from the Articles of Confederation at all. So how did the delegates resolve this issue of how to balance the voices of large states with large populations with small states that had small populations? Because in a situation where all states have an equal number of votes, like in the New Jersey plan, the 60,000 residents of Delaware could have as much say as the almost 700,000 residents of Virginia, meaning that the people who lived in Delaware were, in effect, more powerful. But at the same time, you wouldn't want it so that people living in the larger states could get their way all the time. What if the people in Delaware had a very legitimate concern that those in Virginia didn't share? It would be impossible to get all of these states to agree to amend or replace the Articles of Confederation if some of them felt like their interests weren't being taken into account at all. So to solve this issue of how to weight the representation of the states, the delegates came up with what's called the Great Compromise, or sometimes the Connecticut Compromise. And in a way, what they did was combine these two plans. They made a legislative branch that was bicameral, two-house, with a lower and an upper house. And this lower house would become the House of Representatives, where each state would have representatives in proportion to their population. So states that have large populations have more representatives. States with small populations have fewer representatives. And those representatives would be directly elected by the people. Now, and this time, the people was a fairly small proportion. To vote in the 1790s, you had to be a white man with fairly significant property. So it wasn't full suffrage. It wasn't even full suffrage for white men. But these folks were elected by vote. Then this upper house would be the Senate. And in the Senate, each state would have 2 senators, regardless of their size, so that as legislation moved through Congress, first from the lower house, where it would be approved, and if approved, sent to the upper house, there all states would have an equal voice in whether legislation was passed. And in this upper house, the senators would not be directly elected, but rather appointed by state legislatures. And in fact, senators were appointed into the 20th century. Now, the Great Compromise wasn't the only compromise made at the Constitutional Convention. They made a number more, and we'll talk more about those and about the other 2 branches of the government in the next video. In the last video, we discussed the Great Compromise made at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where delegates who were trying to craft a new governmental system for the United States agreed on how the legislative branch of the government would be set up. And the agreement they made was that it would be a 2-house or bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives, where the representatives would be apportioned based on state population, and then a Senate, where every state would get 2 senators regardless of its size. And this is just one example of how the framers of the Constitution tried to introduce a notion of balance. In this video, I want to zoom out a little bit and look at the broader Constitution, because the legislative branch was really only one part of it. In fact, there are 7 more articles of the Constitution. So here I'd like to spend some time taking a closer look at some of the other articles, paying special attention to the executive branch and the judicial branch. But before we do that, I just want to take a moment to marvel at the size of the Constitution. Not because it's so big, but because it's so small. So this is the first page of the Constitution, famously starting with "We the People." But the entire original Constitution could fit on 4 pages. Compare that to the constitutions of many other nations, which are hundreds of pages long. And I think the idea here in having a constitution that's really only 7 articles long was that it was going to set down principles. This wasn't going to be a whole set of laws that outlined everything that a state should do in any situation, but rather a set of broad ideas around which lawmaking decisions could happen. In a way, you could think of the Constitution as being kind of broad enough to be flexible. They spoke in larger generalities that could be applied to many different situations. And I think the proof that this was a good way to think about putting together a constitution is just in the fact that we still have this constitution today, more than 200 years after it was written in 1787. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest constitution in the world that is still in effect at the national level. I think that's a pretty big deal. So how did this Constitution work? Well, let's look a little bit more closely at these first 3 articles and the branches of government that they created. So one of the ways that the framers of the Constitution attempted to remedy the problems caused by the single branch government under the Articles of Confederation was creating a 3-branch government. So one branch established in Article 1 would be the Congress, and within this building is the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this would be, in the eyes of the framers, really the most powerful of the branches. They gave Congress the power to make law, to tax, to raise an army, to coin money. They really envisioned that most of the day-to-day operations and most of the power of government would fall under the duties of Congress. But one thing that the Articles of Confederation had lacked was a powerful executive. So the second branch of government, established in Article 2, is the executive branch, the head of which is the president. And the job of the executive would be to enforce or carry out the laws made by Congress. And that would include doing things like waging war. Remember that the first president was George Washington, who had been the general of the Revolutionary Armies. But the president could also kind of have the front lines on dealing with foreign nations, so negotiating treaties, and would also have the power of appointing many government officials. And lastly, the third branch would be the judicial branch of government, established in Article 3. And the head of the judicial branch would be the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. Of course, there are many other smaller courts below it at the state and district level. And the Supreme Court's job, along with other courts, would be to interpret the law, to see whether or not things done by Congress and the president fell within the bounds of the Constitution. And the framers really thought that the judicial branch would end up being the weakest branch of government, although both the presidency and the Supreme Court have grown in power over the years. Now, this is an incredibly brief overview of these 3 branches. These articles include lots more in them about the specific powers of each of these branches and the kinds of requirements one would need to become a representative or president. So I highly recommend that you read more about the Constitution and check out these articles. But what I want you to get out of this is that the framers here were trying to separate the powers of government. So they wanted to make sure that to avoid having too much power in government, Remember that they are trying to escape from the monarchy. They want to make sure that government power is kind of diffused among these three branches, with the idea that they're going to have to argue with each other to get things done. They're going to have to cooperate with each other to get things done. So the separation of powers is one of the key principles of the Constitution. Another key principle is checks and balances. So what do I mean by checks and balances? Well, this is the idea that each of the branches of government has the power to check, in the sense of stop, like checkmate in chess, the other branches of government. And I think of this as kind of like a giant governmental game of rock, paper, scissors. Now, there are many ways that these branches can check each other, but I just want to give a couple of quick examples to help you understand what that might be like. All right, well, say that Congress makes a law, and the president doesn't like that law. Well, the president can use the power of the veto to kill that law. And if Congress gets annoyed enough with the president, they might use their power to impeach the president. All right, well, what about the judicial branch? So the judicial branch's main checking function is declaring laws unconstitutional. So the president or Congress may put through a law that the Supreme Court says is not consistent with the Constitution. Judicial branch can then kill that law by declaring it unconstitutional. All right, well, what happens if the other branches are unhappy with the judicial branch? One way that the president can check the judicial branch is through appointing judges. This would kind of change the composition of the court, the people on the court. And so over time, the presidency can influence who is on the Supreme Court and how they rule on laws. And lastly, if Congress isn't happy with the Supreme Court, they might be able to impeach justices or change jurisdiction of the lower courts. So in this way, like the separation of powers, the framers intended to make sure that one branch couldn't get too powerful because it would be able to check the other branches. And you could really think of this as being a brilliant way of harnessing people's natural inclination to look out for themselves. As rivalries developed, as people tried to do what they thought was best, they could help keep government honest by fighting among themselves. And as they all strove and checked each other, would keep all of government from becoming too powerful. This is a chart that shows the percentage of the total population of each of these colonies and then later states that was made up by enslaved Africans. Starting in the year 1754, which we'll show in purple, and comparing that to the year 1800, which we'll show here in green. Now, some of these numbers are estimates, since the census didn't exist before 1790, but this can help us get an overall sense of how the institution of slavery changed in these years. Now, on the left side here, we have the data from the northern part of the country. Now, in purple, you can see the percentage of the population of each colony that was enslaved in 1754. And generally, it wasn't a very large amount. I think New York here had the most at about 14%. By 1800, however, you can see that the percent went down considerably. Some, like Massachusetts, outlawed slavery altogether, so they're at 0%. And others, like New York or Rhode Island, began a process of gradual emancipation, phasing out slavery. Another thing to note is that new territories in the West that were claimed by the United States either had very small amounts of slavery, like in the Indiana Territory, or none at all, like in the Northwest Territory, where slavery was outlawed. Now, let's compare that to the same period in southern regions. In most of the South, in 1754, Enslaved people made up a very significant portion of the population. In some cases, like in South Carolina, outnumbering whites at a rate of more than 60% of the population. And unlike in the North, as you see here in teal, in 1800, enslaved people remained a really quite large percentage of the population. In some cases, the percent of people who were enslaved grew considerably, like in Delaware or in Georgia, and in other places it stayed about the same. In places like Virginia and South Carolina, the percent of the population that was enslaved actually dropped over this time period, but not because there were fewer slaves, but rather because the white population had grown faster than the enslaved population in the same time period. And unlike in the northern territories, the percentage of enslaved people in the new southern territories claimed by the United States, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, was quite significant as well. So what's happening here? Why, over this 50-year period, did slavery begin to die out in the North while surviving and even expanding west in the South? How much change was there over this time period in the regional attitudes about slavery? And how would we even go about figuring that out? One way that we can attempt to measure the extent of change is by identifying the things that stayed the same during this time period, which we call continuities, or aspects of society that continued on being the same as they were before, and changes, aspects of society that were different than before. There are many different aspects of society that historians can trace changes and continuities in over time, like changes in politics or art or gender roles. But for this video, I'm going to choose economics and ideas. Why am I choosing those two? Well, first and foremost, because slavery was an economic practice. It was a source of labor that supported the production of agricultural products. Second, I know that in this time period, the American Revolution introduced radical changes in ideas about liberty and equality, which stand in stark contrast to the institution of slavery. So let's compare the economic systems and ideas about slavery in each of these regions in 1754 and 1800 to see what changed and what stayed the same. So first, let's look at the economic systems. In the North, where the climate and the soil was not suited for large-scale plantation agriculture, the economy centered around family farms in 1754. Proximity to the coast facilitated fishing and shipping, and the people who actually did this work tended to be either the owners of the farms or the boats, or indentured servants, and a small number of enslaved laborers who worked for them. None of these activities really required the labor of a large number of enslaved people. All right, well, what about in 1800? Farming and fishing and shipping were still going strong. But as the first industrial revolution began to take off in the late 1700s, factories began to spring up in the North. And the cheapest labor source for these factories was immigrant laborers, not slaves, not indentured servants. Now let's look at the economic systems of the South in 1754 and 1800. In 1754, plantation agriculture, based on enslaved labor, was the central economic system. And it was also the central economic system in 1800. But unlike in the North, where the technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution made indentured servants or enslaved laborers unnecessary, the major technological innovation of the cotton gin made cotton easier to process and therefore saved it as a profitable crop, which made slave owners eager to expand the institution of slavery rather than phase it out. Next, let's take a look at the ideas about slavery which were commonly held in each of the regions. In 1754, in the North, I would say few people questioned the existence of slavery. Northern shipping was involved in the Atlantic slave trade. The idea that masters deserved to rule slaves was as natural as the idea that kings deserved to rule their subjects. Even free people of color were rarely considered full British citizens the way people of English descent were. How did things change in 1800? The Revolutionary War had a strong effect on the ideas about slavery in the North. Northerners applied the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality to long-standing ideas about social roles, and they found that slavery was incompatible with them. So after the Revolution, northern states either abolished slavery or began to phase it out with gradual emancipation. But I want to caution you into thinking that this turned the North into a racial utopia. People of African descent were still not permitted to become American citizens, even though the immigrants who were beginning to flood in from Europe were. So I think it would be fair to say, overall, that the North had never really needed slavery. And therefore, when the Revolution led many to question the institution of slavery, it was pretty easy to abolish it. How does that compare to the South's transition in this time period? Well, by 1754, the notion that slavery was natural and enslaved Africans were property was pretty well ingrained. But the ideas of the Revolution didn't have quite the same effect on the South as they did in the North. If anything, by 1800, white Southerners were determined to enact harsher slave codes than ever because they feared uprisings, since the ideals of the American Revolution had inspired the Haitians to overthrow the French. So why do these changes and continuities over time matter? Well, because by 1800, you start to see attitudes around slavery crystallizing in the United States, creating a North where slavery was rare and considered a perversion of the ideals of the Revolution, and a South where slavery was central and considered natural and perhaps even a desirable way to organize society. And as white settlers from each of these regions moved farther and farther west into territories that were opened up by the American victory in the Revolutionary War and by Indian removal, both Northerners and Southerners would export their economic systems and their ideas about slavery into these adjacent Western lands. By 1820, this gradual process would erupt into sectional crisis over slavery.